Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Michael Clare, a Five College professor of Peace and World Security Studies and director of the Five College program in Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. His books include American Arms Supermarket, World Security, Challenges for a New Century, Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws, Blood and Oil, and The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. And his latest book just out is All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Welcome to Background Briefing, Michael Clare.
Pleasure to be with you, Ian.
Well, thank you, Michael. And just to touch on the report that came out today from the Global Carbon Project, the world has lost another year to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, 2019 is an increase. Global warming gas emissions have grown slightly, reaching another record high, and the year, of course, is not quite over. The total emissions from fossil fuels and industry totaled 36.8 billion tons, and that's up 0.6% from 2018. So we're heading in the wrong direction, and not surprised given the leadership we have and the priorities of Trump and the people he's working for, which are largely the fossil fuels companies. And then, of course, the other connection is that we are talking here today when Nancy Pelosi and a delegation of Democrats are in Madrid at the COP25 climate change conference, at which on Friday, Greta Thunberg, who has just sailed across the Atlantic to Madrid, will be leading a demonstration on Friday. So there you have the two sides of it, in effect. You've got an alarming report saying we're not going in the right direction, and we know that we only have a small window to reverse things. And two, you've got one of the leading climate protesters or human extinction protesters out there who has galvanized a whole younger generation. So there's the despair and there's a hope. Then there's your book, which I think is incredibly important, Michael, because in this country, the military is one of the few last institutions that the broad cross-section in this divided country respect the military. So if we can somehow, as your book does, cut through the denial nonsense and get people to recognize how the Pentagon is seeing what's happening and how they're preparing for it, and also how they are actually adapting and trying to deal with the reality of climate change. So, again, I put that in the category of hope as opposed to despair. So I know I've given a speech here instead of asking you a question, but the first question would be, is that why you wrote the book, to essentially make people aware of how dangerous the situation is, but also aware of the institution that they trust is actually dealing with it in a realistic way?
Well, I think you did a good job, Ian, of capturing the intent, my intent in writing the book. First of all, I found in searching through Pentagon documents and my interviews with people in the military and retired officers a very distinctive picture of climate change that you don't always hear from environmentalists and climate scientists, which is to say people in the military view climate change not only as a threat to habitats and to species, endangered species, but they also see climate change as a very severe threat to the survival of human societies. They see that climate change is going to very rapidly, in fact already, is causing the breakdown of societies in vulnerable parts of the world, in Africa and the Middle East, where resources are scarce and where people fight over things like food and water. In this environment, climate change is going to make conflict much more likely, producing mass migrations, pandemics, state collapse, chaos, all of which, of course, will bring the military into the picture in a way that they prefer not to have to deal with. So for them, climate change is a very severe threat to global stability. And I think this picture is something that is not often discussed in the environmental community, in the scientific community, but adds to our picture of just how threatening climate change is going to prove to be in the years ahead.
Well, as you point out, the Pentagon officials fear that essential resources will dwindle in many poor and divided countries, provoking conflict among internal factions and threatening the survival of fragile governments. In this chaotic environment, terrorist groups will flourish, while dispossessed farmers will migrate in search of jobs, typically encountering hostility wherever they go. All this instability will result in deadly pandemics, incessant warfare, and a relentless call on the United States to provide humanitarian relief and troop support. But you have to add to that what the chaos that will be happening abroad will also be happening here, because ocean rises will swamp a lot of the East Coast, particularly Florida and the barrier islands off the Carolinas. It will be so hot in Arizona and Nevada that people can't live there. So we'll have internal migrations, maybe 10, 20 million people moving within the United States. So the picture is so extraordinarily bleak. And yet my hope is, and I guess it's your hope, Michael, that somehow people will start listening to the military types who are tasked with the reality of facing a threat. This not a military threat in a sense, but a global threat which endangers us at all.
Yes, and the military faces this not only in terms of the missions that they will be forced to undertake. So when you speak of all the threats to Florida and the rest of the country from rising sea levels and from extreme storms, in all of these cases, the military will be called out increasingly in the future to engage in what they call defense support for civilian authorities, DISCA operations, where they will be providing relief and emergency assistance activities. They see this more and more take a part of their mission in the future as the United States itself comes under assault from climate change. But compounding the problem from their perspective is the fact that many of their own installations, bases and installations, are themselves at severe risk from climate change. Many of their most important naval bases, for example, are up and down the east coast of the United States, from Florida into the Carolinas and especially in Virginia, where Norfolk Naval Station, the largest naval base in the world, is right squarely in the crosshairs of climate change, both from rising sea levels and extreme storm damage. And they understand fully well that as climate change advances, these bases are going to become inoperable. And so they face a double challenge of protecting the nation from increasingly severe risks at a time when their own facilities may not be available to them. So they have a very clear-eyed notion of the threat posed by climate change. And I think this message, if brought to the public and hopefully to Congress, can alter the debate in this country away from partisan bickering to a notion that we face a threat akin to war and that we have to rally together to take urgent steps to reduce the threat posed by climate change.
And again, I'm speaking with Michael Clare, a five-college professor of Peace and World Security Studies and director of the five-college program of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. He's the author of Blood and Oil and The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. And his latest book just out is All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. And it obviously got close to home in terms of the Pentagon in the recent hurricane in Florida that trashed the Pensacola base, and they managed to get some of the F-22 stealth fighters out before the hurricane hit, but there were a bunch of them because they're so damn expensive and they have to be maintained, and they're a bunch of hangar queens, as they call them. a lot of F-22s were trashed along with the hangars, and these are extremely expensive airplanes. So it's already happening, isn't it, the destruction of these bases?
Absolutely. In the past year alone, from beginning with Hurricane Florence of about a year ago, which destroyed much of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, suffered $3 billion in damage. Then a month later, Hurricane Michael in Florida, that's the one you're referring to, which destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, another $3 to $4 billion worth of damage, including those F-22s. And then earlier this year, during one of those cyclone bombs that we hearing about occurred across the upper Midwest, causing immense flooding of the Missouri River, and the flooding overtook Offutt Air Force Base, the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, no less, flooding that base entirely, causing another $3 or $4 billion in damage. It doesn't include all the planes and the equipment. So that gives you an example. That's just 1 year, 3 bases, $10 billion or more worth of damage, and it's unclear whether those bases will ever be restored to their full operational capacity as they were before.
So do you think, just getting back to where I see the value in what you've written here, was cutting through this argument, and particularly the possibility of getting the denialists to recognize reality, is because the Pentagon has to deal with reality, and you can't have fake news in the Pentagon because, lives depend upon it, and somebody's in the field makes up a story or calls in coordinates that aren't real coordinates or that aren't the accurate ones, and instead of defending a bunch of troops, they blow up a kindergarten. It's an intensely reality-based community, is it not, the military?
Yes, you put it right. They can operate on fake news. The people I've spoken to in the military in preparation for writing this book are, as you say, reality-based. They operate on the basis of logic. They have to know what is the environment in which American troops are going to be deployed or asked to risk their lives. They have to know, is the environment changing? What are the climatic conditions they are going to face in the years ahead? And this is very serious, and they're very concerned. For example, it's very clear from scientific studies that temperatures in the Middle East, in the greater Middle East, are likely to exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit from now on in the summertime during the heat of the day, and probably in many areas exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit for long stretches of time. You can't put a soldier out there with 60 or 80 pounds of gear into that condition and expect them to carry out their function. People die under those conditions. So they're very aware that climate change is going to alter the battlefield in very significant ways. They also are aware that the Arctic is changing dramatically. The Arctic is the northern frontier of the United States. There was once covered with ice, making it impossible for ships to operate there to pose a threat from that direction. Now the ice cap is melting, and the Arctic is becoming an open ocean in which Russia and China are now sending their ships. So the Navy has a whole new ocean to operate in, and we're unprepared for that. So the Navy has to address climate change in that respect. They can't ignore it. They can't go pretend that there's no such thing as climate change.
Well, back to the report that came out from the Global Carbon Project that indicates that in 2019, rather than reduce